Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you how to finish a neckline with bias tape, specifically a V neckline. I am using this single fold bias tape that I have on a roll, and you're going to need to keep in mind, depending on the size of tape you're using, about the seam allowance. The pattern has a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you will need to trim your seam allowance if the fold on your bias tape, like mine, is only a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to need to trim that down. I've actually already trimmed it down. And to start, you are going to place the bias tape along your V-neck, and you're going to stitch down to the point. And if it helps you, you might want to mark the point using a ruler. Place it along each edge, the distance of the seam allowance, so you can see your seam line there and you know exactly where that point, that center point, falls, because you want to stop stitching at that center point. So starting from one edge, you're going to stitch down to the point and back stitch and stop. If you are following along with the Roxy sew along, you do want to stitch on your straps before you begin this part. And when you start sewing, you're going to begin right at the edge of that strap, leaving yourself a little bit of room, and this is what it's going to look like when you're done. See, I've stitched all the way to that point, and now there's a little bit of origami. You're going to fold the bias tape down perpendicular on itself and then back up. So I'm just going to slow this down so you can really see what's going on. From the point, I'm pulling the loose end of the bias tape back. That angle is going to go straight down from the point of the top, and the bias tape itself is going to cross perpendicular over itself and then gets folded back up. And the fold should be in line with the loose, not stitched down edge of your bias tape here. And now I'm going to start stitching at that same point, but I want to catch just past the edge of where I stitched before. I'm going to get a pencil so that I can mark it. Right there is where you want to start stitching, and you don't want to catch that folded edge underneath. You want to start right past the folded edge, and you're just going to stitch all the way up to the strap. And this is what it will look like when you are done with that step. You can see that I sewed right from that point upwards. I did not catch the other bias tape underneath. And on the back, you can see my stitches meet perfectly at the point, and you want to clip through that point. Clip through the point too, but not through the stitching. So this will help us turn really well. And the next step is going to depend on the size of your bias tape. My bias tape when I fold it like so, with the folds facing inwards, and you are going to mark it. You're going to, from the point that you stitched from, perpendicular across your bias tape, draw a line. And then you are going to fold your bias tape in half, measure it. This is going to be the finished width of your bias tape. And you're going to draw down from that line that same finished width. And fold it and give it a nice finger press to mark the center fold if you don't have a double fold bias tape like I do. And from that center point to the edges of the first line, you are going to mark and make a little triangle, and this angle is what you're going to stitch. This line and this line is what you're going to stitch on, not your straight lines, those lines. Zoom in so you can see that a little better. This is my perpendicular line from my stitch point. Then I came down the width of my bias tape, marked my center point, and drew in the two angled lines. Also, you are going to want to go back stitch your previous stitches. And here you can see I've stitched those points, and now I'm going to cut the seam allowance. And cut at these angles. Don't cut through your stitch lines, but you want to get all that extra stuff out of the way. And now you're going to turn this inside out. Use a point turner if you have one. And this is kind of where the magic happens. You're going to fold the bias tape under and then fold it under again. And once it's pressed, which I recommend pressing this before you go to stitch it down, once it's pressed, you'll have a nice little point on your bias tape, a very clean mitered corner, and when you stitch it down, you're just going to stitch straight to that point and straight up. If you are not following along with the Roxy sew along, the rest of this is not going to be for you, but you can skip to the end to see what the finished point looks like. If you are sewing the Roxy dress, you will stitch down your straps to the back edge, and you'll continue your bias tape around the corners, around the armholes. Make sure to back stitch them, and then we're going to start with the front strap point. And what you're going to do is fold the raw edges of the bias tape in, and then fold your whole seam allowance down, and then turn that folded edge of the bias tape in again. This is the front corner. Again, if you are not making the Roxy dress, this does not apply to you. So you can finish off your V neckline. And once you have that down, you can see you're just going to have a little angle to stitch across. Again, fold the raw edge in, flip the seam allowance down, and then flip each edge of the bias tape in. And you can see I have a little extra that needs to be trimmed off there. You might have extra depending on how much you left yourself. And then when you top stitch it down, they're gonna meet at that point. There I go, trimming off my extra. So you can see where those two corners meet. I'm just gonna cross my stitch over at that corner whenever I'm top stitching my bias tape. And then on the back, you don't want to trim your seam allowance across the center back, because we're gonna fold this down a quarter and then another quarter. There's a 1/2 inch seam allowance in there. You could finish this with bias tape as well. I personally just chose to turn it, and then again the same bias technique. I fold the raw edge and then fold the seam allowance and then fold the second turn of the bias tape. These aren't very technical terms I'm using. I hope this all makes sense to you. Again, you may have to trim. And as you may know, the Roxy pattern is in fact drafted as a reversible top, but this tutorial is for those who want to have a single layer top that is clean finished on the bias. And you're just going to stitch straight across. If you use pins, it might be helpful to pin some of this. I'm very stubborn and don't like to use pins. So you're going to top stitch that armhole and then just go straight across the back. And when you're done, everything is going to look like this. Clean, lovely, turned at the back. My bias tape's a little bit longer than my seam allowance, so there's a little bit of a unevenness there, but that's okay. And your V-neck point is going to look beautiful as so. On the inside, it looks beautiful. Everything is top stitched down. We have our stitching coming to a nice little point in the front. You can see that. See how that comes to a nice point and catches the bias tape on the back. There's a little bit of an opening. You could hand stitch that down if you wanted to. I'm not really worried about it. And you can see our beautiful crisp V neckline. I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial. It took me a while to figure this out, so I hope I did an okay job of explaining it. Thank you so much for joining me, and happy sewing.